Thank you. And on the negative team, UQ NCI.
First, Noah, say them. Cormac speaking second and reply here.
And everyone's as
Fantastic. And now just some motion stuff. Which motion are we doing? Nuclear. All right, the nuclear.
And we veto the top one, and we veto the middle one.
Alrighty then. So, just the speaking times haven't changed. They'll be the normal 6 to 8 minutes. The debate is being live streamed by Andre and also recorded as a backup by me. Is everyone okay with that? If there's any changes, just let us know. Otherwise,
Can I put this beside your camera?
yeah.
They've come a long way from like copying up the phone with the banana.
Yeah. You wrap yourself in a body speak.
There we go.
There we go.
Perfect. All right. And Umbar will be doing the timings today. All right. So, you good to go, Andre?
We're good to go.
All right. Without any further ado, let's welcome the first speaker outside of Fermi to begin the debate. Here.
Sorry, just before we do that, can I just prop my phone for you to stream?
It's being live streamed by Krabi.
Oh, so I don't even need to do this.
Yeah. Sorry, I just texted you a minute ago.
I might practice it. Okay, so I can kill this entirely.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Make sure it falls through that.
Sorry, man.
Good to go.
I believe so, yes.
Nuclear energy is core to the renewable transition. It provides energy that is cheap. It provides energy that is green. It provides energy that requires little inputs and has little outputs. And requires energy that will be the base load upon which solar can build, that will be the base load upon which wind can build. That is a core part of the transition. It is abhorrent that the renewable movement has forgotten about it, that the movement has fallen to misinformation. The movement has allowed that misinformation to spread. It has allowed that to lead to less nuclear power plants that when they are built are less safe. We're the side that stands behind more nuclear, and we're the side that stands behind better nuclear. 3 things. Setup, why we get more nuclear, why we get better nuclear. First, on setup. First, 2 things to explain here. First, this is not the environmental movement of high school debates. Obviously, the environmental movement is broad, it is diverse, it has a number of actors. Those actors do include the people of social advocacy, the Greta Thunbergs or Neil deGrasse Tysons or Bill Nye the Science Guy of the world, but it also includes some political parties, that is the Greens in the EU Senate, that is Teal Independents in Australia, that is even members of the Republican Party in the US, those people in the Tea Party that are very supportive of nuclear. It also includes investors, so people like George Soros, Warren Buffett, ESGs that are trying to do climate-friendly activism within companies. It also includes intellectual capital, people like scientists. We are happy to mobilise all of those people in support of nuclear energy. What then does support look like? 3 things. First, obviously this does not preclude us messaging about things like climate justice. The motion implies that it is for renewable energy advocacy, so things like climate justice, things like reparations are still things we can obviously do. What do we then support? Obviously this is likely to be diverse. So it could be things like advocating for the construction of more nuclear energy. It could be things like educating people about why nuclear energy is safe. It could be things like including it in climate negotiations, like going to COP and explaining that they should make part of investment in renewable energy, part of investment in nuclear energy. Third, obviously it's likely to be diverse by movement. That is, the way the German movement does this will be different to the way the French movement does it, will be different to the way the Rwanda movement does it, will be different to the way the Japanese movement does it. Obviously the movement is not homogeneous, we can be discreet in how we do it. Okay, first argument, why we get more nuclear. This argument is going to explain 2 things. First, why nuclear is a good thing. Second, why there is vastly more of it on side affirmative. Why is nuclear a good thing? 2 things to know. First, it is a broadly superior form of energy for 3 reasons. First, it's extremely cheap. That is, once it is constructed, and obviously it has a high construction cost, once it is constructed, it's extremely cheap to keep running. All you need to do is provide micrograms of uranium to power cities. That is not a very expensive input cost. Second, it's extremely environmentally friendly. Almost the only waste constructed by this is some amount of nuclear waste, which is very easy to dispose of. For instance, in Australia, there are just like places in the desert we can put it under relatively cheaply. Third, it's extremely powerful. That is, a small amount of input provides enough power to cover entire cities, relative to things like solar or wind, which are obviously useful, but nonetheless have low amounts of power, tend to be more variable. Second thing to note about why it's really good is it's extremely stable. That is, it's really good as a baseload form of energy. That is, you can put in power at all hours of the day, regardless of weather conditions, regardless of anything else, and will keep producing power at a stable and predictable rate. That is important because it's distinct to all other forms of renewables. Forms of renewables like nuclear, like wind, like solar, like hydroelectricity. Those forms of renewables vary based on climate conditions, vary based on the time of the day, which is obviously something that we need to build on top of. Currently, countries are doing things like building on top of LNG. We would support them building on top of renewables, which are vastly better. That is what nuclear can do. So, why do we get more nuclear? Broadly, 3 reasons. First, there's vastly less popular opposition to nuclear. Why? Fourth thing to notice, in the status quo, people hate nuclear. For the reason that they have irrational fears built on past problems, like things like Nagasaki, things like Chernobyl, things like Fukushima. Those narratives are dramatized, they're blown up, they're magnified in comparison to the horrors of things like coal energy, which has also produced similar scales of disasters. So, there's a vast amount of popular opposition that is currently the barrier to constructing nuclear. Why do we get rid of it? 4 reasons. First, there's more intellectual capital explaining why these are safe energies. So, for instance, popular scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Science Guy, can go out and explain to people why it is that it is safe and easy to use nuclear energy. They will assuage their fears by explaining that yes, there have been accidents, but those accidents are few. They pale in comparison to the deaths caused by coal. And I think a good analogy for how this works is vaccines. That is, there's a strong medical movement that explains to people that even though vaccines have had side effects, people did suffer blood clots from the COVID vaccines, but nonetheless able to explain to people that in the majority, these are safe and reliable things. Second reason we get less popular opposition is there's less local resistance. That is, the green movement is not going out and finding figureheads in, say, the French countryside who say, my town has just had a nuclear energy built nearby, and they can become the figurehead of the movement. Now the green energy is actually going out to these people and explaining to them why the local nuclear power plant probably provides them jobs or something. Third, we emphasize that the disasters are of the past. That is, we emphasize that things have changed. We explain the ways in which regulations have improved. We explain the ways in which they are much more safe. Finally, the mechanism of popular mobilization is just gone. That is, even if people still dislike nuclear, which we think they're unlikely to, the way they mobilize that is gone because the party that represents that is no longer standing for that, so it's far harder for them to organize against nuclear. Second reason there's more nuclear is that there's less political opposition. That is, A, less parties are advocating against it in politics. But B, less parties are making that contingent on coalitions. For instance, in the EU, a number of coalitions like those in Germany are formed by green parties that are often quite influential and often make resistance to nuclear part of their program. This is unlikely to happen now. Third, it's bipartisan. That is, it's depoliticized because there are no parties advocating against it or for it. The Green Party is now standing for it. That means there's less political debate. Final reason we get more investment, so we get more green nuclear energy, is there's simply more investment. Because this does 2 things. First, it directs investors to actually go out and invest. For instance, people like Warren Buffett and Soros invest in nuclear more. But second, it legitimizes people who would previously want to invest because nuclear is, as I'll explain in a second, a good investment, but would not because they were feared as being perceived as anti-green. Now these people can go out and do more investment. So, we get more nuclear investment, that's obviously a good thing. But the second way we win this debate is we explain that there is likely to be nuclear investment on their side as well, but it is of far lower quality. Why is there likely to be nuclear investment? 4 things to know. First, you can often sell this energy. For instance, Ukraine sells its nuclear energy across the Balkans. Second, often it is a good investment because though it is a short-term startup cost, the long-term investment, as we explained, is very good because nuclear energy is very cheap. Third, often there are political parties that do support it, so when political parties do get into power, sometimes they will make that nuclear energy. Final thing to note is often it's okay to hide nuclear energy, so often countries in, for instance, France or Germany, built nuclear energy in the 90s without popularly discussing it. So you're likely to get some amount of nuclear energy under this slide too. Why is it worse? Broadly, 3 reasons. First, it's constructed worse. Why? First, there's less intellectual capital. You have people like scientists less engaged with it. Second, the government is less open about it, so it cloaks it in regulations. It does not discuss it publicly. It does not solicit public consent. Third, it builds it in areas that lack local resistance. So, for instance, when France was building nuclear power plants in the 90s, they built them on the border with Germany so that German citizens would get upset rather than French ones. That is a reason that you get bad construction under their side, because it is placed in places that are politically useful rather than places that are actually optimal to build nuclear power plants. Second reason you get worse nuclear power plants on this side is they're more politicized. So, their budgets are less stable because when political parties come in or out, they change it. Second, the nuclear power plant people are less willing to ask for more spending because they're worried about a political issue. So they're less willing to do things like upgrades or safety mechanisms because it is an extra cost that makes it less popular. Third, these parties are spreading misinformation, which means people are politicizing it, they're responding badly to it. Final reason you get worse investment under their side is that, as I've explained, green investors are unlikely to invest under their side but are on ours. So people that are investing are less likely to be responsible. They're more likely to be people that try and make the maximum amount of money, which means they're probably less likely to support things like safety, the broader support of the movement. Clearly, we're the side that stands behind green energy in the way that is responsible, in the way that stabilises the climate transition, and we're the side that ought win this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now have the negative speaker up to indicate the side negative here.
I'm so good, thanks. The environmental movement did not fall to misinformation when it comes to nuclear power. They were extremely aware of the horrors that nuclear energy can cause. And even if those horrors were, as Jack claimed, comparable in some way to the deaths of coal, there was something much more compelling about the deaths of millions of people in Hiroshima that inspired fear about all sorts of nuclear energy to the average person, about the millions of people who got cancer in Chernobyl. That is a haunting memory in the public mind, a haunting memory that they do no work to prove that they can overcome. That is the barrier to doing nuclear energy. We ought to try other options that are obviously becoming quite successful. That's how we will win this debate. Let's do a couple pieces of setup, and then I'll give 3 arguments that mostly respond to the material that was given in that speech. Alright, firstly, we agree that when they heavily prioritise, they can do all the things that they can do. Let's observe the alternative, which is that we can have a much more targeted energy policy. You can advocate to your local, national government and say, oh, okay, in our context, we think solar would work really well, or we have this big river, let's build a dam and do hydroelectricity, this kind of thing. The observation I want you to make there is that ours is much more specific. Let's deal with that material about baseloads then, because this material is perhaps worked 50 years ago, but it does not work now. Batteries are extremely good nowadays, meaning that, and they're getting increasingly good, meaning that things like solar energy oftentimes don't have a baseload problem anymore, because you can just store the energy that you gather during the day. But also hydroelectricity is incredibly good for baseloads because rivers continue to run at approximately the same speed. Observe the thing there is that rivers are extremely common compared to where you might be able to set up nuclear energy, because you can't set up a nuclear power plant on a fault line if it's going to flood, if you don't have the right terrain and all of these kind of things. So there's a big restriction there on who can actually set up these different kind of things. The last thing to observe is that in context, many people are moving away from nuclear energy, that the countries who have committed to nuclear energy have committed to it. They already have nuclear power plants. And other countries have decided, no, that's not the direction we're going to go, and they've invested money in other kinds of schemes, building solar farms and whatever else. So, 3 arguments then in the speech. Firstly, on why you're unlikely to get public support. Secondly, why you're unlikely to get governmental support. And finally, on why even if you get both of those things, nuclear energy is a bad idea. Alright, first thing to observe, I think, is that the status quo trend in the world is that people are largely on side with renewable energy. Not many people just hate coal for the sake of it. The kind of objections to solar farms is that they're an eyesore or something like that, or that they think there's information about baseloads and stuff that they still believe. Obviously, that's something we can try and change as well. The thing that I want you to acknowledge about that is that the big opposition under their side is that you make a large change to people's energy grids. And a large changes to people's energy grids are people that is something that voters are not very comfortable with. They're not comfortable with it because they rely on energy in their everyday. So if you make a massive change and there's a risk to it, they might not have power, which is a really scary thought to the millions of people in your country. That's why that's the first reason why it's really unpopular, because you make a massive change. I think the second reason is because there is a massive amount of fear around nuclear energy. And observe that this fear is particularly harrowing. It is particularly visceral. And it is true that coal might kill people. It is true that maybe fucking birds get killed in wind farms. But that is nothing compared to the horrors that nuclear energy has caused. And I think they can't say, we're going to go and educate people about this. Listen to the explanations that they give in Jack's speech about how they're going to change this. They say, oh, Bill Nye the Science Guy is going to go and explain to you that nuclear energy is okay. Weigh that against what you saw in Chernobyl. I think one of those is much more convincing to you. They say they're going to explain the regulations to you. What do you think the average voter knows about nuclear power plant regulations? I don't think that is very compelling to them. So there is a massive distaste of this. It is stored in their memory. There is also quite a rational fear of it, because things can go wrong. If you live in a dangerous area and something goes wrong with these plants, you may die. That is terrifying. Third reason why I think they are unlikely to get popular support is the environmental movement has traditionally been opposed to it because they did a lot of social activism, which meant they were opposed to nuclear armaments and in turn then opposed themselves to nuclear energy as well. That memory exists in the environmental movement in a lot of places, which means people who voted for green parties and stuff like that are unlikely to buy in support of it because they are committed to that kind of position that nuclear in any sense is something that is really, really bad. So I think that's another reason why you're unlikely to get people on board. All of that goes to show that you are not getting the votes for this, that you need to institute the kind of energy policy. Under our side, those people do vote for green parties, they do support environmental movements, they do lobby companies, and we are able to get the kind of energy proposals like solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric, all the things that we support under our side. Secondly, while you get no governmental support, observe that there is a ridiculous claim in Jack's speech that there is no one advocating against this. There is obviously people advocating against this for exactly the reasons that I gave you. Political parties appeal to the average voter and capitalize on the fear that exists around it. Other reasons why governments will advocate against this. Firstly, the upfront cost is massive. They admit that there's a large upfront cost, then they lie to you and say there's no maintenance cost. There's obviously a huge maintenance cost. You need to have technicians on site all the time. You need to maintain the fucking neutron guns that you use to split uranium atoms and stuff like that. It's a massively technical project, right? Compared to solar farms where you just have to wipe down the fucking solar panel if it gets dust on it. There is a massive difference there in the kind of upkeep you need because it's a massively technical and dangerous project. All of those, is a reason why the government would not want to kind of do this, would not want to spend the money on this. Comparatively, under our side, our investment can be slow and tailored. You don't have to spend a bunch of money up front, and the maintenance costs, the investment costs all come at a much slower rate, which I think is much more appealing to governments, especially if you are in debt or you have other things to service. That is especially important for developing nations who have urgent things that they need to focus on. You have to explain that you're going to spend half your budget on nuclear energy and not build any more schools, or not give any business subsidies for the next 4 years, or something like that, which I think is an insane claim for developing nations. Secondly, in developing nations, it also makes you incredibly dependent on developed nations because you need to buy uranium from them, and the largest uranium reserves exist in Australia and Canada. But secondly, they are the only places that can refine uranium, so you need to pay them to refine your uranium as well. And then you need to buy the shit to build the nuclear energy from South Korea or the US, which is obviously, firstly, incredibly expensive, secondly, incredibly unpopular, and thirdly, makes you incredibly dependent on the West for developing these, which I think is also really, really bad. Finally, it's obviously really disruptive to old industries like coal or gas or whatever, which means that those companies lobby really hard against it and go to political parties and say, no, this is a really, really bad idea. Obviously, that's for the reason that more energy decreases their energy prices. Whereas the slow transition towards something like something like solar is something that those companies are much more okay with, and oftentimes companies like Shell and Chevron invest in these kind of things because they can slowly change their business structure and keep on top of it. Finally, even if you did manage to get nuclear power against all of those opposing factors, why is it still really, really bad? Firstly, it is likely to be implemented badly. That is because you can only understand exactly what safety operations and stuff you should have after something bad has happened, and it's very difficult to copy from other plants because obviously your plants are not the same, and obviously they're in different environments, there are different risks, all of these kind of things. The second reason is that they use a massive amount of water, which firstly should be of concern to the environmental movement, especially in places that have restrictions on water and do not have it readily available. The additional problem is that when you use water to cool a nuclear reactor, it heats the water, then you pump it back into the river, and it destroys the ecosystem because fish indeed cannot live in boiling water. Thirdly, because of the nuclear waste, which is not only a long-term accruing problem, which is something that people recognize in foresight and governments recognize in foresight, but becomes very difficult to deal with when it starts amassing, especially if you don't have much space to deal with it. And finally, because it does not allow you to diversify the grid in the way that we want to, because we allow people to opt into different energy systems to balance out the risks that might occur with either of them. But if something goes wrong with your nuclear power plant and there is an accident, you cut off all of your baseload power that they're advocating for. At the end of this then, the environmental movement is never going to be successful if they advocate for nuclear energy, and if they are, it is disastrous. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now have the second 20 speaker up from the pesticide app. Here.
The best material from the negative is that this won't work.
and I think that's kind of their best proven argument. The other argument is that even if it does work, nuclear power is a bad idea. It harms the world. I think this is their argument that just doesn't have any analytical rigor attached to it. Because if you go through them, they're poorly made. They say there are no safety checks and balances before the fact, it can only come after the fact, which is literally fake. Like clearly you can do things like train personnel, you can keep the power and reactor core deep underground, you can do things like use the immense amount of literature that has been created about nuclear energy since time immemorial. Notably, I would explain that in the past we've already done a lot of research into nuclear energy. There are already plants that exist. That sometimes in the Rust Belt there are also people who work in nuclear power plants, like literally look at The Simpsons. It's a good explanation of how immense and ubiquitous it was in the past. It is only met recently feared because of the things that happened in Fukushima. So clearly there are safety precautions that you can use. People have been doing it since time immemorial of nuclear energy. That was a lie. They don't say that, well, water is used inappropriately. Like, how on earth is water used better under your side? Like, you still need to heat water under your side of the debate. Like, how else are you going to actually refine the coal, or actually use the coal, burn the coal, and wash it? Like, clearly you are using water inappropriately. But also, nuclear energy does not actually pollute that water that badly. It is only when it is enriched inappropriately. For example, it is enriched past the point, like a nuclear atom bomb, for example. That's when it pollutes the water. But when it is not enriched that far, that is, it is only enriched to the point of using it for energy specifically, that is when the water is safe. That's why in Fukushima, the bomb that happened there didn't mean that Japan needed like massive amounts of new water. They didn't all suffer because there was a nuclear fallout that happened in Fukushima. It was just an explosion. This is not an atom bomb. You misunderstand the scale of things going wrong in this debate. But thirdly, I don't understand why water is so important when it comes to the fish in the sea, when you are polluting through other things like coal seam gas, and you're also doing things like putting pollutants in the air. Clearly, this is going to be attracted into the water. It pollutes the fish. Worse, nuclear energy is cleaner. The fish are better up on the outside. And they'll also say that you can't diversify your energy grid, which misunderstands how energy grids work. Like, you just create the power, you create kinetic energy, which also moves into, you create thermal energy through kinetic energy, and that thermal energy turns into electrical energy, and that is the thing that powers things. The question is how much kinetic energy, how much thermal energy is put into creating electrical energy. The diversity is symmetric on both sides. Clearly, it is more diverse on the outside of the debate. Notably, you might be thinking, oh, well, they have a little bit of harms happening there. Like, there are some slivers of harms that you haven't rebutted, Jeremiah. But clearly, their harms are just not that expansive, because the hundreds of instances where nuclear energy has been used across the globe is like the countries that use nuclear energy today, South Africa, Japan, like countries in Africa themselves. Clearly, the instances where they've been used as nuclear power plants are larger than the amount of harms that they can point to, like Fukushima and Nagasaki. It is a lie to suggest that this is harmful in and of itself. The only way they can beat us in this debate is to suggest that the environmentalist movement will fail, but even then they cannot win. Because even if the environmentalist movement fails in its attempt, we would suggest that principally the environmentalist movement must push for this. Why? Firstly, because the environmentalist movement has an obligation not just to itself, but also to future generations. Even if you cannot protect, even if you cannot make actual change, the attempt to do the change is significant in the debate. Because the attempt to try and save a person's life, note that the lives in the future are magnitudinous in scale, to try and not fix climate change, but mitigate the effects of climate change is immense. But secondly, I think that the environmentalist movement can do other things as well as this. So the cost to the environmentalist movement, principally to do other things, is not costed in this debate. So this is a value-neutral thing at worst for us in this debate. Finally and thirdly, you must advocate for nuclear energy, because it's the domain that the environmentalist movement is the most intellectual capital over. Because if you don't enter into this space, what happens is that other actors who use nuclear energy, for example, violent actors who want to use it to use nuclear weapons, and are able to argue you should use nuclear weapons because there might be a disaster, but we can use it to save ourselves into the future by fighting other actors. The environmentalist movement should co-opt all the rhetoric or the space in which nuclear power is talked about, and talk about how no, you shouldn't be using it for weapons. If we're going to decide how to use this ton of uranium, we should use it for energy itself. Clearly, the environmentalist movement has the best capital, has the most information, has the most science, it has the most visceral ability to change people's minds. It has an obligation to enter into the space to stop people from misusing the rhetoric and misuse the tons of nuclear energy that exists in the world. 3 imperatives then exist in this debate beyond the principle. The first is which side can deal with nuclear energy the best. This team runs away from their burden and says that, well, the harms are bad. Well, no, you still have nuclear energy under your side. You should listen to our speech at Jack, who will punish you in this issue for why you cannot listen to him. Because nuclear energy is still used to some extent by actors, to the extent that they are used because it's cheap, it can bring in a lot of money, and some corporations still have some plants that are, enriching uranium to sell. Now, what we do is that when environmentalists enter the space, what it does is it regulates those actors more. You enter it into the minds of the populace. You also do things like change the way in which governments address it. That is that governments do things like say, we're going to enter more into space more. We're going to allow more market competition to enter more. That means there's less cutting of corners. So under your side, there are no explosions, because obviously it's quite safe. But the safety equipment for a lot of actors is actually quite minimal, because they can afford to do things like not actually invest that much in it, because there's very little regulation. There's very little market competition for nuclear scientists. Where can they go if all they have is just one plant in the Rust Belt? Clearly, if you set up more, you are able to reduce that harm significantly. The second imperative we have in this debate is that there is an imperative to create better energy. That is, firstly, it is more stable energy. And also, they say, well, other forms of energy are stable. Literally a lie. You have not explained that. Also, the industries you're talking about actually just require a lot of lithium, which drakes up more than it actually does all of the harms that we talk about in this debate. And I think it's hard to store very minimal amounts of solar energy. You think that solar energy is so efficient. Why has China used millions of acres to use solar panels? Clearly it is not as efficient as you're talking about. We use less land than necessary because you need to only work vertically. For you must go horizontally and deforest everything. You destroy the environment in the use of your forms of renewable energies. Third imperative that Jack gives you is that we give better nuclear energy. This is all the material that we give you about how current actors use nuclear energy quite badly, and now they're able to enter into that space and mitigate that. Let's talk about their attacks on being able to change the scope of nuclear energy use. They try to attack our benefits by saying that people will perceive it as unsafe and so will not like nuclear energy. I think that this belies the comparative. Like you think that, think about the vaccines, right? Everyone was scared to get the AstraZeneca because it could give you blood clots. People were afraid of taking maybe airplanes, but because there's so much discourse, there's so much assuaging of the fears, people talk about it more, and environmentalists say, I understand your fear, but here are all the safety precautions. Look at the numbers, look at the images of people who've used nuclear energy and have been able to save themselves. They can also use counteracting images. The harrowing image of a community that no longer has sufficient amount of coal, and so their community is in the dark, cannot heat their water, are dying in the cold. Clearly nuclear energy increases the amount of energy in the market. This reduces the prices on energy, which is a visceral energy you can show people. Clearly, more expensive energy is disastrous for people. They then say, well, this harms other industries, so people don't want it. Literally a lie, you do not explain this. You say also that it looks contradictory from the past. Literally a lie, you don't explain. But also, it's unclear why the environmentalist movement cannot change its rhetoric. There are stakeholders in this debate who can internalise the issue of whether or not we need to change and are able to have their fears assuaged. That is the delta in this debate. They have no other material. They need to defeat our benefit. They don't.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now have the second negative speaker up, communication side. Meg, here. No. Hang on the website behind you.
I'm ready to reply.
Good to go. Are you okay?
Yes.
That's right. All good, everyone? Good. Right.
Two observations at the start of your speech. The first is that the affirmative team runs a very short-sighted case, because the real comparative that we set up very clearly from first negative is not that we keep running coal, but that environmental movements advocate for other forms of renewable energy, things like solar power, like wind power, like hydroelectricity. So the comparative that they try to point to in several instances as to burning coal and using that water to clean coal is very uncharitable to what we are supporting. And, as we note from the start of the debate, the largest change in this debate occurs in the developing world, because those are the countries where they have to sacrifice the huge pushes towards hydroelectric projects. hydroelectric projects that not only create huge amounts of power for the citizens of those countries, but provide clean drinking water to the citizens of those countries when you dam those rivers, that allow people to work in those industries that are far less technically skilled than the types of nuclear power industries where you have to import people from the developed world in order to work in them. That was the comparative they had to defend. And that takes down the largest push of their principal argument in Jerry's speech, because it is not the case that we are failing to protect future generations. Secondly, this is a trade-off debate. The assertion from Second Affirmative that they can do both is clearly not true when the motion requires them to defend heavily prioritising this. That comes at the cost of other forms of energy that you can advocate for in the first place. So, 3 questions. Is this even a superior form of energy? Is this popular, and do governments uptake this? So, is this a superior form of energy? And note that if they cannot prove this argument, they have literally no way to win the debate, because at that point we are advocating for a better form of energy and we have more efficient uptake. Their claims are twofold. Firstly, they say it is a cheaper form of energy. Let's firstly take into account the huge upfront costs. Imagine how big nuclear reactors are. You have to build huge cooling towers. You have to build incredibly intricate technology that you can literally split an atom that is like invisible to the human eye. That is an incredibly complicated process. And importantly, the developing countries that we're talking about their energy industries in this debate do not have access to the types of resources and the types of technical expertise to build these reactors. There are only a few countries in the world that actually specialize in this type of technology. For example, South Korea, for example, the United States, which means the developing countries have to turn to those countries and therefore ask for their support, which also increases the upfront cost, right? Because they're from developed nations, they're incredibly expensive, and you have low currency value to buy into those things. But secondly, there just is a lot of maintenance costs. Uranium is not very cheap. It costs a huge amount of money to dig out of the ground, to refine. There is not a huge amount of it in the world, which means there is a maintenance cost in that. But the other maintenance costs, which are far, far larger, are the people you have to employ. Because it requires a huge amount of technical expertise to work in a nuclear reactor, to be able to monitor it safely, to be able to uptake the regulations. That is why nuclear power industries in the United States hemorrhage money each year. They lose billions of dollars each year because it is so expensive to uptake and because they do not generate huge amounts of power compared to other industries. The last thing is you are incredibly reliant on the developed world for the type of energy industry under their house, which makes it far less popular, as I'll talk about in the rest of the debate. The comparative under our side is renewable energy. For example, solar power, wind, does not require a huge amount of maintenance. You build them, you clean them every so often. Sometimes they break in 10 years and then you just build another one. It is far, far cheaper, a far lower cost up front, which means developing nations are far more able to invest in it into the future. Then they say, well, high baseload power. Firstly, there are other options for high baseload power. Their assertion that hydroelectric energy does not provide high baseload power is a lie. Look at, for example, snowy hydro scheme in Australia that is being developed to generate a huge amount of baseload power in a country that does not otherwise have nuclear energy. And the reasoning behind this is very simple. Rivers run all the time, which means they are generating power all the time, and therefore generating power even during the night when things like solar energy fail, even during when there are no periods of wind, when wind energy fails. So you can have that baseload power from things like hydroelectricity. But secondly, as we told you about, there are things like batteries. They are being developed incredibly quickly, which means you are able to store the power that you generate during the day from solar power and then use it at night. Then they say, well, lithium. Firstly, it is asserted that we use huge amounts of lithium. Also, nuclear power uses huge amounts of technology under your side. We are far superior. Then they say, well, horizontally, you have to build huge amounts of areas to put solar panels. Obviously, countries can specialize in terms of what types of energy they put where, and so for example, countries that have huge amounts of area that is unused and where people don't live can invest in those types of energies. And secondly, you can build them vertically as well. You can see solar panels that are built vertically in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia. That's something that also happens. Let's then talk about negative externalities. These harms are not contingent on reactor meltdown, although that is a huge harm as well. These harms were even in these successful reactors. They say, well, it's environmentally friendly because you can just dump waste in the middle of the desert where indigenous communities live. And that's only in Australia, the biggest country in the world. Look at all the other countries in this debate. Developing nations where millions of people live all around the world. Where are you going to put waste in those countries? Are you going to sell it to another country and they're just going to put it next to their citizens? Obviously, there are huge negative externalities. This is waste that causes cancer in people, that we do not have a safe way to get rid of. And before they say, well, we'll just shoot it into space, obviously some rockets blow up, which means you cannot shoot nuclear waste into space because it generates nuclear waste and creates a dirty bomb. That is incredibly harmful under their side. The other thing is, they say, well, you're not using the water to clean the uranium and therefore uranium doesn't go into the ecosystems. Again, ignoring the argument we made. it is not the fact that uranium goes into the water. It is the fact that when you use the water to cool the uranium, it becomes incredibly hot. That means, firstly, use a huge amount of water very, very quickly, water that can otherwise be spent on like giving your citizens clean access to drinking water. And secondly, the hot water then gets pumped back into rivers, which kills all of the fish in those rivers, means they cannot reproduce, kills all of the plants and animals in those ecosystems, which is incredibly harmful and fucks the developing world's environment, obviously incredibly bad. We also told you this was likely to be done badly. Jerry says flippantly, well, you can just put the reactor underground, which is where earthquakes happen, which means you'll have a nuclear meltdown more likely under your side. These guys clearly do not know anything about nuclear energy. Do not give them the win. Then they say, well, other actors will make this worse. Firstly, they never really explain this. Secondly, we flip this because the risk is when you generate a huge amount of nuclear power plants and you give nuclear material to a huge amount of countries in this debate, that creates a huge amount of risk. Because when those countries are politically unstable, you can go in and you can take over a nuclear power plant and steal nuclear material and make weapons out of it. When, for example, these countries go to war with each other, you can target nuclear power plants and blow them up, which creates huge externalities for the citizens living in those areas. Obviously incredibly harmful. But secondly, they never proved that these environmental movements cannot also use their rhetoric under our side. Because if it is the case that nuclear power exists in some of these countries, the minimum number of countries in this debate, only the very, very developed countries, environmental movements can still advocate in those countries for it to be done safely without advocating for its use at all. So, that means they have no pathway to win. Let's then talk about our pathway and why we blow them out of the water. Firstly, about why it's incredibly unpopular. No, this has to be comparative to the types of renewable energy we are talking about. We told you why people are incredibly fearful of this. They say, well, education. But it's unlikely to be effective because the types of fear we're talking about are harrowing. And people are incredibly fearful of things that they do not understand, of things that they perceive to be incredibly harmful. The Fukushima reactor meltdown was less than a decade ago. People still had that in their recent memory. They're likely to be incredibly scared. Chernobyl was a recent media documentary. It is in people's memory. They say, well, local support. Be comparative, guys. Renewable energy on our side also generates jobs. It can be uptaken more by citizens because you can put solar panels on your roof. So it is incredibly popular locally. Thirdly, environmental movements. And all of their material is actually contingent on this because if they do not prove environmental movements advocate for this effectively, they cannot get any of their benefits. We tell you there is at least some reason that some parts of these movements oppose this very, very vehemently. They connect it to the past of nuclear disarmament. And those people that are key figures in the movement, for example, Bob Brown in the Greens movement, are incredibly important. And when you fracture those movements, you are less likely to be able to have an effective environmental advocacy. That means advocacy is more effective on our side. But even if they prove that their argument is more popular, we told you that governments were not likely to take this up because of the high upfront costs, because it means you're reliant on the developed world, and because it is disruptive to existing industries. That means even in their very, very best case, they do not get any change. We get more change through renewable energy that actually matters. So proud to oppose.
There you go for that speech. Wrap up the third portion of the application. Welcome to the third photo speaker. Here.
Up until now, this team has been very strategically vague about what their alternatives look like. But the Duke is well and truly fucking up because everything is expensive. Everything requires investment, and everything except nuclear is deeply politicised and opposed by the right. But also, everything has waste that needs to be disposed of. Our case is not that nuclear is perfect. Our case that it is comparatively the easiest to adopt. It has comparatively the most literature and research. And it gives the environmentalist movement the best shot of literally saving millions of lives into the future. This team needed to do a lot more to explain why all of the dangers that they identify about, you have to change your energy consumption, and there is some backlash, do not apply equally to their pretty vague set of whatever is best in the region. I'm going to prove two things in this speech. First of all, I'm going to prove that comparatively this is the easiest form of energy to adopt, and second of all, I'll prove that it's adopted well. First of all, why is this comparatively the easiest form of energy to adopt? The reason that this material is important is that it establishes three things. First of all, it explains that this is where the environmentalist movement gets the most return. And the note that I'd made here, although it's pretty obvious, is just that this is pretty time sensitive. Like, green energy needs to happen pretty quickly in order to save an enormous number of people's lives. So obviously the environmentalist movement should prioritise whatever is the most effective. Second of all, this establishes that the environmentalist movement can improve it. So if it is true that sometimes this is adopted anyway, all of the dangers that this team identifies are worse in their world when the environmentalist movement does not divert capital towards it. We improve it. But thirdly, we we explain that if this is initially right now the easiest thing to adopt, then into the future, all of their solutions are far, far easier. Because yes, it's true that some other kinds of energy can be used as a baseload. We explain that this is the easiest thing to use as a baseload and the easiest thing to adopt, which means that all of their alternatives that are, regionally popular, although I would know that receives very little explanation, are far better in our world. Why do we explain that? First of all, we tell you that that nuclear is an area where governments get the most return, and that is just because it is so efficient. And this explanation is kind of scientific, but it's just the fact that yes, there is a startup cost, although there is a startup cost for everything, and literally 1 gram of uranium powers like an entire hotel. Like for this entire tournament, we've all been living off like 1 fucking gram of uranium. That's really good. But we also explained to you that often the startup cost has already been paid by a lot of governments, like free Fukushima, like. France has an enormous amount of investment already into nuclear, and that means that the startup cost actually is lower. A lot of things like hydro and solar, the startup cost is still there, and governments still have to fork it out. That's not true of nuclear. But we also explain that the returns from nuclear uniquely trickle to other renewables. That is, once you have the baseload, then you can use it for the other industries. You can use it to pay the startup cost. And we also explained to you in Jez's speech there are other incentives, like military incentives, to invest in nuclear. So the startup cost actually is really low. This is a thing that is comparatively the easiest thing to be able to afford for governments. And their claim is like, nah, man, but there are just so many fucking rivers. First of all, no, there aren't. A lot of countries are in the desert. But what problem do you think we're trying to solve? This is a debate about climate change. The rivers are drying up. All weather conditions are extraordinarily unpredictable. That is not true of things like uranium. The second reason why we explain that this is comparatively easier to adopt is that this receives pretty broad support across the political spectrum, and a lot of opposition to green energy comes from the right. But we explained to you at Jack and at Jez, to literally no response, that the right in a lot of countries actually is really strongly in support of nuclear energy, and often it is the environmentalist movement or the left that opposes it. And that is for the reasons we explained structurally in Jez's speech, which is, first of all, they want it for weapons, like the US military wants to invest in nuclear, but also a lot of Republicans that represent Rust Belt states do benefit financially from this. So this is easier to push through because there is less opposition from a particular political party. But thirdly, as we explained to you, a lot of countries just already know how to do this. They use nuclear for other things. They've already done a lot of investment before people were afraid it was dangerous, which means this is really easy to invest in. What do they say? First of all, they say, we'll just support whatever alternative is best, with, as I explained earlier, pretty little explanation as to what that looks like and why it will not receive a particular backlash. And I think that is pretty lazy. Like, the scattergun approach is just like, well, whatever's better than yours, that's our side. That obviously needs more explanation, and third negative is far too late. But second of all, we explained to you that diversifying actually makes the environmentalist approach worse, because in our world, you can get broad investment into one thing. You can pull an intellectual and monetary resources to make this activism more effective. By spreading everything out, they make it less effective. The next claim, and I guess sort of their most intuitively persuasive, although we respond to it comprehensively, is just that the memories of the danger of nuclear are pretty haunting. A few responses. First of all, we explained that uniquely on our side we can assuage those fears, which is particularly important if you believe that governments already will invest in this a little bit. Obviously, this material explains that uptake is better on our side for a few reasons. First of all, the note that I make is just that we're fiating in a huge amount of support that doesn't exist now. So imagine everyone's fears, but now there's like billions and billions of dollars combating those fears. Second of all, we explained to you a lot of analogies where people are afraid of things in the past, but they can bounce back in the future, where there is sufficient investment into convincing people those things are fine. Like, a lot of us, got on a plane, despite the fact that in very recent memory we've heard a lot of memories of plane crashes, and that's because there is a huge amount of investment that tells you, well, travel is fun, well, Australs will be really good, and those things can exist similarly from the environmentalist movement. But also, it's just things like vaccines, that people get vaccines even though blood clots happen. The third thing that I note, though, is yes, people are scared of nuclear, but as time goes on, they are more scared of climate change, especially young people who are really, really important stakeholders in this debate, and in terms of making political change. Young people now are far more scared of dying because of climate change, of not being able to have children, of not knowing what the future looks like at all, whether they will be able to spend time with their friends, or whether their lives will be drastically different than they are of things like Fukushima, which are a distant memory to a lot of people. But fourthly, we explain that this is something that is depoliticized. And the note that I'd make here is that a lot of the reasons that people are fearful of things is because it is politicized. Like political parties have an incentive to make you afraid of things. On our side, we explain uniquely there is broad support, which means that people's fears are dispelled. People in our world are not scared of nuclear, they fucking love it. But the second thing that I note is that this is not just about convincing individuals, it's also about market incentives, and the market incentives, as we explained to you down the bench, to very little response, do overcome these kinds of fears. Like investors aren't really scared of Fukushima, they want to make money, and we explain that this is an effective way to do so. The next claim is that, well, this is costly, this upkeep is unpopular. A few responses. First of all, most of the problems that they identify are true of all renewables, and they need to be comparative. But as we explained to you, buy-in from the right means that this shift is significantly more politically palatable. But second of all, we explain that comparatively upkeep of nuclear is actually pretty cheap and pretty easy to maintain into the long term. First of all, because it's pretty high tech, so you can just automate a lot of these things, or you can make them far easier to be able to do. But second of all, because there's an enormous amount, as we explained to you, of literature and research which makes this far easier. At the end of that, nuclear is clearly the easiest thing to adopt. It gives the environmentalist movement the best chance of success. Why now will nuclear be adopted well? I know two things. First of all, as we explained, nuclear happens anyway. First of all, by some governments, but second of all, by perverse actors like the military. And so this team needs to be comparative. If they are so scared of nuclear, we explain that it is used better in our world. But the second note that I'd make is that nuclear has other benefits. It has other benefits, and we empower the environmentalists to be able to use them. Their first claim is, well, it's unsafe, there's so much waste. First of all, we improve that because we give people more information, more capital, and more investment into safety, which means that those things are far better. Second of all, we explain though that the risk is just so low. Because there is so much literature and so much research, like they literally case it in concrete and bury it into the desert. You can use things like fans, and obviously those things are far better on our side when there is more investment and more buy-in. The next point is, well, developing countries become dependent, and that is bad. A few responses. First of all, that's just pretty symmetric. Like this is how globalization works. Like unfortunately, yes, it is true that climate improvements are harder for the developing world, but they never explain why this is unique. But second of all, our side rebalances that more because this is the only thing you use uranium for instead of nukes. But thirdly, we would know that if there are other solutions that are really obvious, this is activism. It doesn't force people to take it up. If there is another kind of renewable that's really, really obvious for a developing nation, they'll just do that instead. But fourthly, developing nations do have power in this area. Countries like Kazakhstan have a huge amount. We would say that it is better that these countries use nuclear power for environmentalist change instead of for war, which is the comparative on their side. For all those reasons, both sides matter.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now have the negative speaker up to conclude the stage portion of the negative team of the vote. Here we go.
Panel, I want you to know the absolute absurdity of trying to use Bill Nye to debate someone in the marketplace of ideas as to why they should disregard the very active memories that they have of their family and friends getting cancer in Chernobyl, if they're in that region, of the active imagery that they have of people's skin falling off in the HBO show about this very topic, and instead listen to rationality and reason. If it was so true to simply debate people with facts and logic, I think we would have probably just stopped climate change hundreds of years ago. People are not rational. People have fears. People do not like taking the risk of their baby getting cancer or of all of the animals in the place that they live having two heads suddenly for the trade-off of some kind of climate change harm which they do not experience in the status quo or do not believe that they experience in the status quo because that is slow moving compared to the instantaneous nature of nuclear accidents. The only thing that they say in response to this is, when we debate with people about vaccines, note the example that they give of AstraZeneca, which literally stopped being issued in most of Australia at the point at which there were 5 deaths because the imagery of that very real instantaneous harm was enough for people to trade off the sort of nebulous risk of getting COVID into the future. They had to prove that they forced people to erase our memory that was so visceral and so harmful. 2 things in this speech. Firstly, is nuclear good? And secondly, do you get people to support it? Note that if you win this first issue, debate's over. If it's bad, they probably shouldn't do it. Let's talk about that. Firstly, I want to talk about this push as to how it is implemented worse if the environmental movement isn't there to police it. I think the problem with this is the idea that if you do more of it, there will be more safety. Obviously, so incredibly not true. At the point at which people are scared of nuclear and there are like 1% of the grid is nuclear, you have an incentive to over-regulate because that is not something that is seen as ubiquitous. We think that often, at the point at which people are quite like against safety regulations under the status quo because people are biased towards thinking bad things probably won't happen, having more fear of something is probably good because that incentivizes safety regulations when people generally don't really want them and all of that sort of stuff. The second thing that they say is now governments can be less secretive and they don't have to hide their secret nuclear plans. I think this probably just stumbles upon the fact that if it was so easy to convince the populace that nuclear was safe, governments would be making an effort to do this, and perhaps these things are secretive because it is specifically quite difficult to convince people of that. Secondly, let's talk about cost. We just get a bunch of symmetricizing in that speech to say that everything is equally expensive and everything costs money and has an upfront cost. One, obviously also true that solar panels currently exist, but note secondly that the upfront cost is specifically just so much more for nuclear, right? Like you do have to extract uranium from the ground, that looks like mines and all of this other sort of stuff. Solar panels are incredibly cheap. I wish I could implement a reference in this speech and have a bibliography at the end because that is so empirically true. But also note that the cost is, they say that, okay, well these things already exist in some countries, therefore just use that to drive down the cost. The problem with that is that they obviously only exist in developing countries, whereas things like solar panels already exist in a lot of different places. We tell you about a huge dam that has just been built in Ethiopia that gives that country autonomy over their own power grid, which is so incredibly powerful and beneficial for those kinds of countries. The second thing that they say is that there is no long-term cost, because you don't need that much maintenance. The difference between solar panels is that they do not explode, right? That means that for things like nuclear power plants, you need to have people on site 24/7, even if they are not actively doing anything, right? Because we all watch Chernobyl on HBO, right? And you know that you need to actively monitor these things so you can instantly shut them down if something happens. That looks like people who are not just unskilled workers, but people who have backgrounds in nuclear physics, which is obviously not something that a lot of people have, particularly in certain regions and all of that sort of stuff. The last thing that they say is about baseload and why that is really good. Firstly, note how much of an insane uptake it is to literally change the entire baseload that we use. Uniquely on the outside, we tell you we can do that slowly. I'll talk more about that later. But the second thing is that diversity of the power grid is unique to outside of the house. Why is that? That is because it is difficult to justify why you need nuclear and also other stuff if you are advocating for nuclear. When your energy grid is reactive to your environment, you necessarily just diversify the grid by status quo because you have windmills, wind things in some place and hydro in other places and all of that sort of stuff. Why is diversifying the grid good? I don't know, because I'm an engineer. Also specifically because that means that if there is some kind of accident, you have other things to rely on. Note that at the point at which there is an earthquake and your grid is something that is nuclear, you cannot have any kind of energy in the first place. We get batteries on the outside of the house. Batteries are literally so easy. There is so much sun all of the time that means that you have enough of a stockpile that you can do those kinds of things when there is some kind of when there is some kind of sort of event or whatever. Comparatively, they do not have any baseload at the point at which there is some kind of accident that requires all of this nuclear to be shut down, and we tell you diversifying is unique on the outside of the house. Then we also get a bunch of symmetricizing about why everything uses land and all of this other sort of stuff. I want to note just how incredibly bad nuclear is for the environment. Firstly, in instances where things go wrong, but even outside of that, nuclear waste is incredibly detrimental, and it is detrimental in a way that we cannot understand because of the long-term impact of that. They just say that people understand it because there is research. People do not understand what went wrong in Chernobyl still. We know it was something about the graphite and the rods, but apart from that, people do not understand the specifics of it and spent literally 20 years investigating that to work out what went wrong. It is untrue that nuclear physics is just something that you can research and understand. There is a huge burden of knowledge. Again, we tell you the risk of things happening such as terrorism and all of this sort of stuff, of literally just having these things which can be very, very easily used to make dirty bombs at the point at which there is some kind of jeopardizing of safety and all of that sort of stuff. That if these things stop being maintained for literally maybe a week, the harm is catastrophic, and that leads to so many harms and all of that sort of stuff. At the point at which there is an earthquake, you just evacuate an entire city and go somewhere else. Seems like a huge and significant harm. Yet to hear anything that could go wrong with solar panels, except for maybe slightly less energy sometimes in the best case, the last thing that they say is that other forms of energy aren't possible because weather is unpredictable because of climate change. Seems like a really good reason why you're very likely to have a flood on the nuclear plant that you invested billions of dollars into 20 years ago and has an upfront cost, so is therefore very difficult to move. I think that is a reason why the safe places where you can build this are actually very few and far between. Okay, it's bad, but even if it wasn't, why do they actually not get uptake? First thing is what I told you in my introduction, this incredibly visceral memory. Note the instantaneous nature of that, like in comparison to like flow-on and like incremental effects of coal, which are less visceral. But secondly, we tell you about the slow transition, which is really important because there are a lot of people who support solar but do not like the quick transition of power sources, which means entirely replacing your baseload source of power to nuclear is incredibly unpopular. The reason you have to do that quickly is because you have to get a lot of shareholder investment in order to deal with this upfront cost. We have like incremental change, which means it is likely to be more popular with with like populace, but also more likely to get government support. Secondly, note that they don't get investment because obviously your power plant is a bad investment at the point at which there is some kind of accident and no one is like, let's rebuild this and get cancer a second time. But also, in terms of their thing about how you get conservative support, firstly, these people don't care about climate change. So obviously at the point at which you're co-signing a bill in that sense, it is likely to be implemented very badly and it is like probably going to have more like effects and all of that sort of stuff. But secondly, probably bad to give these people what they want. If these people want it specifically for military purposes and nuclear weapons, incredibly detrimental. At the end of this debate, nuclear is bad.
Thank you very much for that speech. We now move to the reply portion of the debate where the speaking times are hard and the speaking order reversed. If you'd like to invite back the negative leader to deliver the negative leader's reply. Here.
The question as a panel you should ask yourself at the end of this round is this. Do I want to risk being assigned to a Sydney cannibalism round in quarterfinals? If the answer is a resounding no, you should vote for the negative team. Two questions in this reply. Which form of energy is better? And secondly, which side gets more uptake? Note that the affirmative team must prove they are better on both of these issues in order to get any of the benefits from nuclear power that they want to talk about. So, let's talk about which side is better. The first thing to note here is that they do a tremendous amount of sleight of hand, because the comparative that we clearly point to from the start is that we focus advocacy on other forms of renewables. The comparative is not just burning more coal into the future. The comparative is not war, because the disarmament movement exists in these places, so developing nations are not just going to use nuclear power for war on our side of the house. In fact, we explained to you why war was more likely when you give a huge number of more nations access to nuclear materials. So, on this, is this better? Firstly, in terms of costs, they are incredibly uncomparative, because for all of their assertions that you only need 1 gram of uranium to power a city, you need 0 grams of uranium if you have a solar panel. You do not need the same level of uptake costs. We explained to you very clearly there are huge amounts of service costs that are unique because of the types of technical skill that you need in physics to do these types of things. And there is a much higher upfront cost because you need the expertise to develop nuclear technology. You need developed nations who are the only ones who provide and build this technology in the first place. Their only responses come to third affirmative, where they say, well, you can automate these things, or there's a huge amount of literature, which are, again, symmetric. There's also a huge amount of literature on other forms of renewable energy. Next, in terms of the baseload, they never structurally prove that nuclear power has a baseload advantage. In fact, all of our claims are about how hydroelectric power and other things like geothermal power also have huge amounts of baseload power generation. And their only response about rivers drying up is very, very flippant. Obviously, global warming leads to sea level rise, which means, in fact, there will probably be more water in the rivers in the first place. We also explained there are things like batteries, which means baseload power is something that you should not really care that much about in the debate. Anyway, then they say, well, other countries will use it better now under our side. Firstly, this is an incredibly small part of the debate because there's only a few countries that use nuclear power already. But secondly, as we explained to you in Inika's speech, there are incentives to over-regulate when it's a smaller portion, and when you have more fear, that is good for regulation under our side. So we do it better. And as we explained, there are huge amounts of other negative externalities that they do not respond to. Things like pumping hot water into rivers, things like nuclear waste being distributed among your populations, and they still do not have an answer for where they can put that. The question you should ask yourself at the end of this issue is Is uptake of nuclear power in the vast amount of the developing world going to be a good thing? Because where will they put the nuclear waste? Where will they pump the hot water? It's going to harm citizens in those countries. Second question on support, and this is where we really blow them out of the debate. Firstly, note the existing trends that we point to, especially in the developing world, to invest money into renewable technology. For example, huge amounts of development projects in hydroelectricity. They divert from that trend, so they have to prove a huge amount of benefit to support in that sense. We need to explain a few reasons why that's not going to happen. Firstly, in terms of fear. And I think the question you should ask yourself here is, do people, more often than not, conquer their fears, or do they avoid them? And we say on the negative team, they're more likely to avoid their fears. And maybe it is the case that some people on their side will be rational and will be informed by this information and suddenly like nuclear power. But probably you should believe, as the average intelligent voter, that most people will remain fearful. Most people have those harrowing images still in their mind. And educating the world about nuclear physics is quite difficult. Secondly, we told you the environmental movements get fractured. No response from this affirmative team. Thirdly, in terms of cost, I've already explained that and why that's unlikely to be popular in terms of governments, especially in the developing world where there are huge amounts of other things that they can spend money on. That upfront cost is incredibly harmful to those governments. And fourthly, in terms of reliance, you are reliant on the developed world. And they assert a third that this is symmetric because of globalization. But the specific and unique reasons we give you in our case is that the only places where this technology is developed is in the developed world, which means you are constantly reliant on them to service the nuclear power plants. You're constantly reliant on them for information. That means that governments do not want to uptake this, even in their best case that this power is effective. The negative side clearly takes us round.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to conclude the debate, we welcome back the affirmative leader. The affirmative leader's reply. Here.
Good to go? 3 questions in this reply. First, is nuclear a good thing? Second, do we get more uptake of it? Third, do we make it better? First, what is nuclear a good thing? I want you to note something important at the head of this point, which is that this is not a setup or characterization point for the rest of the debate. As we explained clearly at second affirmative, the environmental movement does have an obligation to future generations. It ought to advocate for something that is a good thing. So, if you believe that nuclear energy is to any extent a good thing, clearly they have some obligation to advocate for it. Second thing I want to note at the head of this point is that side negative are quite tricksy here, because they try and explain to you that you should judge this relative to renewables. You should be comparative relative to renewables. But the problem is they use this argument without the bench, when they consistently try and explain at every turn why renewables are so awesome. They say renewables are local, they're easy, they're cheap, they're popular, they provide jobs, they provide water to people at second negative, and they're extremely profitable. All of which should lead you to ask, why on earth would the environmental movement need to advocate for these renewables in order for them to be implemented? We have asked this question down the bench. Absolutely no answer has been provided. Clearly, investment in renewables is likely to happen on both sides. So you should not judge this on nuclear versus renewables. You should simply ask yourself, how can we convince you that nuclear is, on balance, a good thing, or would you rather not have it at all? And I would say that we have convinced you that nuclear is, on balance, a good thing. Because we explained in a number of ways that it is cheap, that it is stable, that it is not vulnerable to things like environmental damages likely to happen to climate change, and that it provides a good form of baseload power. Apart from responses that merely compare back to other forms of renewable, for instance saying, well, we can do batteries, we can do hydro, which A, are regional, and B, as we explained, are not actually the comparison you should make. The only real analysis they have here is first, that nuclear is very high maintenance. Something we've explained is something that's unlikely to be true, something that's made much better under our side when we do more investment. Second, that there's some form of nuclear waste, at which point we explain you can bury it in the desert, it doesn't seem that hard. And third, you pour water back into the ecosystem, which I think we dealt with at JES. So, pretty clearly nuclear is a good thing. We therefore ought to have a principal obligation to build it, and therefore, even if you get a tiny amount more investment in it, clearly we take this debate. So, do we get more investment in it? And there are 3 axes along which more nuclear could happen. The first is people, and this is where the most amount of their work is done. Because they say people don't want energy to change, and they say people can be given harrowing images. We respond to these in a number of ways. First, we explain that people's energy could also change when coal can fail, as we explained second and third, unclear why that was not symmetric. Second, we explain that harrowing images are also symmetric, at the point where you can explain to people that the failure of their energy grids, the failure of their renewables, is also likely to cause problems. So, outstanding material here is the material about how we can convince people. And the only way this negative team wants you to think and win the debate is that one of the largest movements in the world, a movement that they conceded our first setup was involving huge sectors of people, would be unable to persuade people that something was a good thing, even though some bad things had happened in the past. Which we said was what had happened with plane crashes, what had happened with vaccines, what had happened with almost every other product we need to convince people to use. Clearly, we would be able to convince people. And even if you don't buy that, we win this extra ways because we explain that governments and parties are more likely to support it, more likely to be bipartisan, and we explain that there's more likely to be investors, more likely to be people like Warren Buffett or George Soros or ESGs pouring money into this, something they've got absolutely no response. So, clearly, there's more uptake under our side. But we win this debate a second time over by explaining that there's some amount of investment on both sides. Something they concede at Cormac when they explain that there are parties that care about nuclear under their side as well. Which means, if you think that their harms are bad but unlikely, this side is the one that makes those harms much more likely because they fail to make nuclear in good ways. We improve nuclear in 5 ways. First, we mean there's more investment. That is, there's more put into making them good. There's more likely to be long-term costs. The budget is more stable. You don't have to worry about budget cuts. Second, there's more regulation. Third, it's less partisan. Fourth, there's more competition between different nuclear firms. Fifth, there's more social awareness of nuclear, so it's much easier to do regulation. We explain that to you at JETS. So, nuclear clearly gets a lot better under this side. This team's only real response is to say, first, there's going to be more regulation under their side because people are more scared. Something we explain cannot happen because there's no competition, so you cannot regulate against the competition. And second, try and weigh this out by saying, well, there's very few countries. Perhaps, but as we explain, A, there are quite a lot of countries, and B, if you believe the harm of a nuclear failure is so high, a side that makes that harm much more likely, much more certain, is clearly a side that ought not deserve to win this debate. Clearly, you should vote affirmative.
Thank you very much for that speech, everyone. Debate. Round of applause for our phenomenal pre-quarterfinalists. Congratulations to all teams. Please leave. We'll have a result for you when they're announced.
Do you want to? Oh wait, here we go.
Good debate. Yeah, sure.